The folder was cream-colored, thick stock, the kind that costs more than it needs to because someone decided the weight of it should communicate something. My name was on the tab in small clean type, June Hargrove. Not June Hargrove plus guest, not June, just my full name, the way legal documents use it. I was sitting in the second row of white folding chairs on the east lawn of Bellhaven Estate when the wedding planner placed it in my lap without a word, and I set my glass of sparkling water on the grass beside my chair, and I opened it, and I read the first page, and I folded it closed again and set it on my knee and looked up at the altar where my sister was about to become someone's wife. My name is June Hargrove. I am 28 years old, and the venue my sister got married in that afternoon belonged to me. This is that story. The object in my hands, that cream folder, that particular weight of good paper stock, was not the beginning of the story. The beginning was a Tuesday evening in September of 2014, when I was 16 years old and sitting at the kitchen table in my parents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee, doing calculus homework, and my mother came in from the living room and told me, in the tone she used for administrative announcements, that the college savings account they had set up for me when I was born had been redirected. My sister Claire was getting married, she said. The wedding would require significant resources. My father and she had decided that the college fund, which had been accumulating for 16 years, which I had been told since I was old enough to understand the concept was mine, which contained $41,000, would be used to help pay for Claire's wedding instead. She said it the way you tell someone their dentist appointment has been rescheduled, with the mildness of a decision that has already been fully made by people who do not expect to be questioned. I was 16. I asked one question. I said, "What about college?" My mother said I was smart and resourceful and I would figure it out. Before I tell you what happened on that east lawn, before I tell you what my sister's face did when the reception moved inside and the reality of the afternoon became fully clear, I want you to know who is watching this channel and what we are here for. If you have been the second child, the overlooked one, the one whose resources were quietly redirected towards someone else's milestone while yours were described as something you'd figure out, this story is yours. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your location and the time in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are sitting right now. I will be back in a moment, and what happens next at this wedding is worth every second you stay for. I grew up in Knoxville in a house that was warm in the ways that mattered on the surface, and cold in the ways that mattered underneath. My father, Gerald Hargrove, sold commercial insurance. He was good at it in the way that men who are charming at work and tired at home are good at their jobs, effectively, consistently, and with most of his better self spent before he walked through the door. My mother, Patricia, ran the household and volunteered at our church, and was the kind of woman who always knew what other people's children were doing and used that knowledge the way some people use a card they haven't played yet. Claire was 4 years older than me. She was the one who had come first and stayed first. First in my parents' attention, first in the family narrative, first in the specific and unspoken accounting of who in the house was worth organizing your life around. Claire was pretty and socially fluent, and she made my parents feel chosen in a way I never fully understood how to replicate. I was good at school. I was quiet. I read too much and talked too precisely, and I had my father's jaw and my mother's stubbornness, and neither of them had known quite what to do with the combination. Claire's wedding was not the first time resources had moved in her direction. It was the most legible time. Before it there had been the car, a used Honda that had been designated for both of us to share when I turned 16, and which Claire took exclusive possession of at 18 when she left for college, leaving me to arrange my own transportation for 2 years. There had been the Europe trip, a graduation gift Claire had received at 18, a 2-week tour of France and Italy with my mother, that I was told we couldn't afford when my own graduation came at the same age. There had been the bedroom renovation. Claire's room had been repainted and refurnished when she was 15, a project my mother described as necessary, while my room still had the same furniture I had used since I was 9. None of these things were large enough, individually, to name directly without sounding ungrateful. That was the genius of them. They accumulated without ever quite crossing the threshold of something you were allowed to be angry about. The college fund was different. $41,000 is not a gesture. $41,000 is a decision. I said nothing at the kitchen table that September evening beyond the one question my mother had answered. I finished my calculus homework. I went to my room. I lay on my bed with the same furniture I'd had since I was 9, and I looked at the ceiling and I began, in the quiet and methodical way I had always done my best thinking, to plan. I applied to 7 colleges. I was accepted to 5. I chose the University of Tennessee, 30 minutes from my parents' house, because it had an honors program that came with a scholarship that covered 60% of my tuition, and because I could commute for the first 2 years and save the cost of housing, and because the business school had a real estate concentration that I had decided, somewhere around the 3rd week of looking into it, was what I wanted to study. I had decided on real estate for a specific and personal reason. I had grown up watching my parents treat the things they owned, the house, the car, the furniture, as the most stable and legible markers of what they had built. The things they chose not to own had mostly been the things that could have built something for me. I wanted to understand property the way you understand a language you decide to learn, because the people who speak it have something you need. I paid for college through the scholarship, 2 part-time jobs, one at a campus coffee shop, one doing freelance bookkeeping for a small dental practice whose owner had posted a flyer on the honors board, and a small amount of federal aid. I graduated in May of 2018 with a degree in business administration, a concentration in real estate finance, a GPA of 3.87, and approximately $22,000 in student loan debt. My parents attended graduation. My mother took photographs. Claire did not come. She was in Nashville by then, engaged to a man named Philip Ashworth, whose family had money and whom my parents spoke about with a reverence usually reserved for weather systems too large to argue with. I stayed in Knoxville. I took a position as a junior analyst at a commercial real estate firm called Ridgemont Partners, where I spent 2 years reviewing lease abstracts and building valuation models, and earning $58,000 a year while living in a 1-bedroom apartment that cost me $640 a month, and eating lunch I brought from home in a container I washed every evening. I paid off my student loans in 26 months. The month I made the final payment, I transferred the amount I had been putting toward debt service into a savings account I labeled, in my own private shorthand, the fund. I had been looking at properties in Knoxville's secondary market since my 2nd year at Ridgemont. Not casually, systematically. I had a spreadsheet, updated every Sunday evening, the way my father had taught me to update the family budget, which was the one useful financial habit he had passed on, that tracked event venue properties in a 60-mile radius of Knoxville. Not commercial office space, not residential, specifically event venues. Properties with the physical configuration and zoning to host weddings, corporate gatherings, private celebrations. I had chosen this niche deliberately. Event venues in secondary markets were undervalued relative to their revenue potential, were often owned by operators who had built them as passion projects, and were poorly capitalized, and were the kind of asset that appreciated steadily in markets where development was constrained by topography, which Knoxville, sitting in a valley between ridgelines, very much was. In March of 2021, I found Belhaven Estate. Belhaven was an 11-acre property in the hills east of Knoxville, 32 minutes from downtown on a clear day. The main structure was a renovated farmhouse built in 1887, expanded in the 1960s into an event-capable facility with a reception hall, a catering kitchen, a bridal suite, and a covered terrace. The east lawn, the one that would matter later, had a natural slope toward a tree line of mature oaks that created, in afternoon light, the kind of backdrop that wedding photographers used as the thumbnail image for their entire portfolio. The property had been operating as a boutique wedding venue since 2009 under an owner named Carol Whitfield, who had purchased it from her ex-husband as part of a divorce settlement and turned it into something genuinely beautiful through 12 years of patient reinvestment. Carol was 61 years old and tired in the way that people who have run event-based businesses alone for over a decade are, not of the place, but of the operating, of the vendor coordination, and the staff management, and the insurance renewals, and the website updates, and the couples who needed hand-holding through every decision. She had been thinking about selling since 2019, had listed with a broker briefly in 2020, and had taken the listing down when the pandemic made buyers cautious, and she couldn't face the uncertainty. When I called her in March of 2021, I had her property on my spreadsheet with a note that read, "Owner fatigue, likely motivated, approach directly." We met at the property on a Tuesday morning. Carol walked me through the farmhouse, the reception hall, the catering kitchen, the bridal suite, and then out onto the east lawn, and I stood in the morning light, under the oak tree line, and I looked at the slope of the grass and the quality of the light, and I understood, with the full-body certainty that I had learned to trust over 3 years of looking at properties, that this was the one. I made an offer within the week. The asking price was $890,000. I offered $820,000, with a 45-day close. My down payment was $190,000. The fund, plus a line of credit against my existing retirement account that I had spent 3 evenings calculating before I allowed myself to draw it. Patricia Holt, the commercial broker I had worked with at Ridgemont and whom I had called first, told me I was moving fast. I said I had been moving toward this for 3 years. We closed on May the 14th, 2021. I was 23 years old. The mortgage was in my name. The deed was in my name. Carol stayed on for 6 months as a consulting operator, which was her idea and which I accepted gratefully because she knew the venue's rhythms, which vendors were reliable, which months were slow, which couples needed extra calls and which ones needed space. By November of 2021, I had taken over operations fully. I hired a venue coordinator named Deb, who had 20 years of event management experience and had been working for a larger venue in Maryville that had recently downsized. I kept Carol's existing booking calendar, honored every contract that had been signed under her ownership, and spent the first winter repainting the farmhouse interior and replacing the lighting in the reception hall with fixtures that were warmer and more directional, and that made everyone who stood in the space look, in the particular way good event lighting is supposed to make people look like the best version of themselves. By the spring of 2022, Belhaven had a waiting list for Saturday dates. By the fall of 2022, I had raised the booking fee by 20% and was still turning away inquiries. In 2023, we hosted 41 events. In 2024, I hired a second coordinator and a part-time social media manager who had a genuine eye for the East Lawn light and knew how to make the oak trees look eternal. I had not told my parents I owned Belhaven. I had not told Claire. I had not told anyone in my family. This was not a deliberate concealment. Or rather, it was, but not the kind born from strategy. It was the concealment of someone who had learned, over many years, that the things she built in her own life were safer when her family did not know about them in advance. The college fund had taught me that. What you announce, you make available. What you keep quiet, you keep. In January of 2025, my mother called me to tell me that Claire was getting married. I said that was wonderful. She said the wedding would be in September. I said lovely. She said they had found a beautiful venue in the hills outside Knoxville. I said how nice. She said it was called Belhaven Estate. She said, have you heard of it? It's supposed to be just exquisite. I said I had heard of it. I said I was sure it would be beautiful. My mother paused. She said, we'll need you to come, June, even if it's a little uncomfortable. Claire wants her sister there. I said I would be there. I want to stop here because I know exactly who is still watching. You are, the one who has been waiting for the moment the circle closes. Drop a comment right now. Tell me you're here. Tell me where you are. Tell me if you have ever sat in a room at someone else's celebration and felt the specific weight of knowing something the room did not. Subscribe if you haven't. We come back to this East Lawn in a moment, and I promise you it is worth the wait. The wedding was on the 27th of September 2025, a Saturday, which was Belhaven's best day. The forecast was clear and warm with a low of 62 overnight, the kind of September afternoon that the East Lawn had been designed by topography and oak tree placement and 20 years of event photography to make look like something out of a film. Claire had booked the full-day package, 212 guests, a florist from Nashville who charged accordingly, a photographer and videographer team from Atlanta, a catering company from Knoxville that I had recommended to Deb when Claire's booking first came through, because they were genuinely excellent, and because whatever my feelings about the occasion, the food at events I hosted was going to be good. I had not spoken to Claire directly in 4 years. Our last real conversation had been at Christmas of 2020, at my parents' house, over a dinner that had been cordial on the surface and had ended with Claire saying, in the kitchen while my mother was out of the room, that she hoped I wasn't still holding on to things that had happened when we were young, because life was too short and she just wanted us to be sisters. I had looked at her for a moment, and then I had said that I hoped the same thing, and I had meant it in the complicated way you mean things you genuinely wish were simpler than they are. My parents had not discussed the college fund with me again after that September evening in 2014. It had simply happened, the way weather happens, and then it was in the past, and the past in my family was a place my parents considered permanently closed. My father had given me a card at my college graduation with a check for $500 and written inside it, in his large, slightly slanted hand, "So proud of what you've done on your own." He meant it sincerely. The sincerity of it was the part I found the hardest to hold. I arrived at Belhaven on the morning of the wedding at 7:30, 2 hours before the first guests. I went through the back entrance, the one the event staff used, and I walked through the catering kitchen and said good morning to the team and checked the East Lawn setup with Deb, who had been coordinating Claire's wedding with the same professionalism she brought to every event, and who knew, as of 3 weeks prior, that the bride was my sister. Deb had looked at me when I told her and said, "How do you want to handle it?" I said I wanted to handle it by having a beautiful, flawlessly run event. Deb nodded and said done. I had arranged my own seating. I was in the second row of white folding chairs on the east lawn, aisle side, left of center. Not the front row. My parents were in the front row, along with Philip's family, the inner circle of a celebration that had been planned with the specific attention to seating that signals whose presence is being honored and whose is being accommodated. The second row was correct. I had put myself there deliberately, with the same precision I used when I arranged everything else in my life. The guests arrived in the hour before the ceremony. My parents greeted me with the warmth they always produced at family occasions. My mother hugged me and held my face in her hands for a moment, and said I looked beautiful, and I thanked her. My father shook my hand and then pulled me in and said he was glad I'd come, and I said I wouldn't have missed it. Philip's family filled the first row on the right side. The 212 guests filled the east lawn in the golden afternoon light, and the oaks stood exactly as they always did, and the whole thing was, I say this without reservation, genuinely beautiful. I had given Deb one instruction for the ceremony itself, a folder. Cream-colored, thick stock, the Belhaven standard, the ones we used for client welcome packages, heavy enough to communicate without saying anything directly. Inside, the cover page of the current year's lease agreement for Belhaven Estate, with my name on it as owner. A single page. Nothing else. She was to place it in my lap sometime during the ceremony. Quietly, after the vows had been exchanged, Deb placed it at the moment the officiant asked the guests to be seated following the ring exchange. The vows were done. Claire and Philip were married. The east lawn applauded. My mother pressed her hands together in the front row, and Deb, moving along the outside edge of the seated guests with the practiced invisibility of someone who has run 200 events, leaned down and placed that cream folder in my lap and walked on. I picked up my glass of sparkling water. I set it on the grass beside my chair. I opened the folder. I read the first page. I folded it closed again. I set it on my knee. I looked at the altar where my sister stood with her new husband in the September light, and I breathed out, slowly, through my nose, and I felt something I had not expected to feel at that moment, which was not triumph and not satisfaction, but something quieter and stranger, a kind of completion, the feeling of a shape that has been open for a long time finally closing. The reception moved inside after the ceremony, into the farmhouse reception hall, with the warm directional lighting I had chosen in the winter of 2021. The tables were set beautifully. The catering was exactly what I had known it would be. The first hour was cocktails and the string quartet I had booked as part of Claire's package, and the second hour was dinner. And somewhere in the transition between the two, my mother found me at the edge of the room near the terrace doors, and touched my arm and said, "Wasn't it all just wonderful?" And I said it truly was. It was my father who understood first. He was talking to Philip's father near the bar when Deb, completing the instruction I had given her in full, approached them and introduced herself as the venue coordinator and mentioned, in the normal and professional way event venue staff mention the owner's presence at an event, that the owner of Belhaven was here this evening and had wanted to make sure the family was well taken care of. She said the owner's name. She said June Hargrove. She said it the way you say a name that belongs in a room, clearly, without weight, as simple fact. Philip's father looked at mine. My father looked at Deb. Deb smiled and asked if she could bring them anything and moved on. My father crossed the reception hall to me in 30 seconds. I was standing near the terrace doors with my drink, and I saw him coming from across the room, and I did not move. He stopped in front of me and looked at my face, and then he said, quietly enough that no one nearby could hear. "June, is this yours?" I said. "Since 2021. He was quiet for a moment. His face did the thing faces do when they are reorganizing a large amount of information very quickly. He said, "How?" I said, "I saved, I worked, I bought it." I said it simply, without decoration. I didn't tell anyone because it didn't seem relevant until now. He said my name. He said it the way he had written it in the graduation card, with a kind of pride that was tangled up in a kind of shame, and which I did not need to untangle for him. I said, "Dad, it's a beautiful wedding. Let's have a good evening." He nodded. He went back to the bar. He did not tell my mother immediately, which told me he needed time with it himself before it became something the family was processing. My mother found out at 9:47 when Claire found out. Claire found out because Philip's mother, who had learned from Philip's father, who'd learned from my father sometime after his conversation with me, leaned over to Claire at the head table during the cake cutting and said something I could not hear from where I was standing, but which I could read in the shift of Claire's body. A sudden stillness, the kind that precedes a turn. Claire turned and looked across the reception hall and found me by the terrace doors where I had been standing on and off for the last 2 hours, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who has just been handed a piece of information that rewrites the last several hours and possibly several years. I looked back at her. I held my glass with both hands. I did not smile and I did not look away. She came to me at 10:03, after the cake was cut and the dancing had started, and the room had filled with the particular noise of a reception that has reached its warmth. She was still in her dress, still carrying the small urgency of a woman who has just understood something and needs to say it before the moment moves on. She stopped in front of me and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. She said, "You own this place." I said, "I do." She said, "Since when?" I said, "May of 2021, 4 years. She was quiet. She looked around the reception hall, at the lighting I had chosen, at the florist's arrangements against the walls I had repainted, at the east lawn visible through the terrace doors in the last of the evening light. She said, "Did you know we were booking it when you—" I said, "No. Mom called me in January to tell me. After you'd already signed the contract." She looked at me. "And you didn't say anything." I said, "I honored your booking. Every detail you chose. The food, the florals, the music. Everything you planned for this day happened exactly the way you planned it. I made sure of that." I paused. "Your wedding is beautiful, Claire." "I mean that." She said, "June." She said it the way people say a name when they don't have the next sentence yet. I said, "We don't have to do this tonight." "It's your wedding night," she said. "Mom and Dad's money." And then she stopped. I let her stop. I didn't fill the pause. I had waited a long time for a version of this conversation and I had imagined it many ways, and in none of the versions I had imagined did I need to say the part that we were both thinking. She already knew what I had paid for my own education. She already knew where the $41,000 had gone. She did not need me to say it. I did not say it. After a moment she said, "I didn't know about the account, June. When it happened, I was 20. I didn't know they used it." I looked at her carefully. I believed her. I had not always believed her on this particular point. It had shifted over the years, my estimate of how much she had known, and where it had settled was somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. But looking at her in her wedding dress in the reception hall of a venue that belonged to me, I decided that tonight was not the night to examine the middle of it. I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry." She said it quietly and without elaboration, which was the way I had always needed it said. Without performance, without the kind of apology that requires the other person to reassure the apologizer. Just the words simply. I said, "Thank you. I meant it." She went back to her husband. I went back to my drink. My mother found me 20 minutes later with the expression of a woman who has been told several things in rapid succession and is deciding which of them to address first. She chose the venue. She said, "June, is it true you—" And I said yes and watched her process it in real time, the recalibration happening behind her eyes as she looked around the room she had chosen for her eldest daughter's wedding, without knowing her younger daughter owned every wall of it. She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "It's a business. I don't usually discuss my business holdings at family dinners." I said it gently. It was true. My mother looked at me for a long time. She said, "We should have told you about the account. I know that now. Your father and I, we handled it badly." I said, "Yes." She said, "You would have gone to a better school." I said, "I went to a good school. I did fine." I paused. "I did more than fine." She put her hand on my arm and squeezed it once and then let go, and she went back to the room and back to her eldest daughter's wedding, and I stood at the terrace door and looked out at the east lawn in the dark, the oak trees barely visible against the sky, and I thought about a 16-year-old girl doing calculus homework at a kitchen table who had been told she would figure it out. She had. In the weeks that followed the wedding, I received calls from both my parents, separately. My father called first, on a Sunday morning, and talked for a long time about being proud of me and about regret, in the way people talk about regret, when they are genuinely feeling it but do not have a full vocabulary for it yet. I listened. I said what I meant, which was that I had built something and I was glad they had seen it, and I was not carrying the past the way I used to. I meant all of it. My mother called the following Tuesday and talked for 40 minutes and said things I had needed to hear for a decade, and which landed, at 38, at this particular version of me, standing in the catering kitchen of a property I owned, looking out at the east lawn in the October light, with the specific complicated grace of things that come late but still come. Claire texted. She said, "I keep thinking about Saturday." I said, "Me too." She said, "Can we have lunch sometime?" I said, "Yes. We have had lunch twice since. It is not simple and it is not false. It is the beginning of something I don't have a name for yet, which I have decided is all right." Belhaven hosted 37 events in the first 9 months of 2025. The waiting list for Saturday dates in September now runs 11 months. I hired a third coordinator in August and am in early conversations with a partner about a second property, a barn venue property in the Smoky Mountain foothills that has been listed twice and pulled twice, and which I have been watching on my spreadsheet for 18 months with a note that reads, "Owner fatigue, likely motivated, approach directly. Some patterns work. I use them." I turned 28 in the spring of 2025 in my apartment in Knoxville, the city I had chosen to stay in because it was mine in a way that had grown slowly and genuinely over the years, the way things become yours when you work on them long enough. I made coffee and sat by the window and opened the quarterly financial summary I run on the first Sunday of every new quarter, and I looked at the revenue line for Belhaven Estate and the equity line and the line that showed my net worth at the age of 28, and I sat with it for a long time the way you sit with something that started as defiance and became, somewhere in the middle of everything, a life. I had not needed my parents to believe in me. I had needed the $41,000, and I had not gotten it, and so I had built the thing anyway, with the scholarship and the 2 jobs, and the container I washed every evening and the spreadsheet I updated every Sunday, and the call I made to Carol Whitfield on a Tuesday morning in March. I do not romanticize the difficulty. It was genuinely difficult. There were months in 2021 when the mortgage was the most uncomfortable thing I had ever lived inside of, and I ran the numbers at 11 o'clock at night and felt the edge of the margin the way you feel a surface in the dark, with your whole hand, carefully, not knowing exactly where it ends. But it did not end where I was afraid it would. It ended on a Saturday afternoon in September on an east lawn under oak trees in afternoon light, with a cream folder in my lap and my name on the cover page and 212 people raising their glasses in a room that belonged to me. To anyone watching who was the one told to figure it out, the one whose resources were redirected, whose fund was redirected, whose future was treated as the flexible line item in someone else's plan, I want to ask you something that I have been sitting with since that September evening. Not what you would have done differently, not what you should have said in the kitchen at 16. This. What are you building right now, with the exact resources you actually have, in the exact city you are actually in? Not the plan you would have had if things had been fair. The plan you are making with what is real. Because the spreadsheet I opened in my second year at Ridgemont Partners did not ask what I deserved. It asked what was available and what was undervalued and what I could reach if I moved carefully enough and waited long enough and did not stop. The folder was cream-colored. My name was on the tab. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I made sure of it, and I would like you to know that you can too. What is the property, the credential, the asset, the document that you have not yet put your name on?